In the first week of December, 1839, a servant at a house on Sloane Square answered the door to a woman in black, her face drawn with what looked like genuine grief, holding out a folded letter and asking, in a voice worn thin by apparent suffering, whether anyone in the household could spare anything at all for a widow left with a large family and nowhere else to turn. The servant took the letter inside. It would not be the last one that week carrying her story to a wealthy address, and by the time a chemist's shop assistant a few streets away grew suspicious enough to finally send for a constable, the woman in the widow's weeds had already delivered a version of her grief, in one carefully tailored form or another, to some of the most powerful and most frequently solicited people in all of England. This is soil of crime, and I am glad you are here for this one. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. The case of Mary Carrol begins in London, in the second year of a young queen's reign, in a city where poverty and performance had already learned to depend on one another. Victoria had come to the throne in 1837, still a teenager herself, and by 1839 the London she ruled over was a city of jarring, immediate contrasts, its grandest new squares and townhouses rising within a short walk of courts and alleys where entire families lived on what a single day's begging or piecework could provide, two worlds separated by little more than a few streets and an entire universe of expectation. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, passed only a few years earlier, had reorganized relief for the destitute around the workhouse system, deliberately making institutional charity as forbidding and as humiliating as Parliament could make it, on the theory that harsh conditions would discourage all but the genuinely desperate from seeking help at all. For a great many working Londoners, the practical result was that a workhouse admission felt less like a safety net than a punishment, and informal charity, a coin pressed into a hand on the street, a folded letter delivered to a wealthy door, remained the difference between a bad week and no food at all. The new workhouses built under the 1834 Act deliberately separate husbandsmen from wives and parents from children on entry, treated all applicants as though their poverty itself were evidence of some personal failing, and offered a standard of food and labor designed to sit just below whatever the poorest independent laborer outside the workhouse walls could scrape together. A woman facing genuine widowhood and genuine destitution in 1839 was choosing, in practice, between an institution built to punish her for needing help and the considerably more humiliating, but at least still independent, work of asking strangers directly. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Into that landscape of genuine widespread need walked Mary Carrol, a woman the police of the day already knew as what contemporary records called an incorrigible beggar, someone who had built a working method out of exactly the costume a Victorian audience found hardest of all to turn away from its door. She dressed in widow's weeds, the full mourning black that marked a woman as recently and legitimately bereaved, a visual shorthand the entire society understood instantly and instinctively sympathized with. It was not a disguise chosen at random. Mourning dress in 1839 carried an almost sacred social weight, a set of unspoken rules about respect and restraint that made turning away a woman dressed for grief feel to most respectable Londoners like a small cruelty they would rather not commit. Consider what it actually took to make that costume work as reliably as it did. Mourning etiquette in early Victorian England operated according to a genuinely elaborate, widely understood code. A widow was expected to observe a formal period of seclusion, typically a full year or more, dressed throughout in unrelieved black, her social calls restricted, her ordinary life visibly suspended in deference to her loss. Every element of that costume, the fabric, the veil, the absence of any ornament, communicated specific, legible information to anyone who saw her, information a Victorian stranger could read at a glance the way a modern viewer might read a uniform. A genuine widow in mourning was, by the strict etiquette of the period, expected to withdraw from ordinary public life for a defined period, not to walk door to door soliciting charity from strangers. Mary Carrol's choice to do exactly that, dressed exactly as a respectable widow would dress, exploited a gap between the era's rules and its instincts. Society expected mourning women to be private, but had built no reliable mechanism for checking whether a woman claiming that status in public actually held it. Sit with the calculation behind that costume for a moment, because it tells you something important about how deliberately this scheme was built. Mary Carrol did not simply ask for charity. She dressed herself in the one visual signal Victorian London was least equipped to question, and let the sight of her do work that words alone could never have accomplished as efficiently. If the sheer precision of that choice unsettles you as much as it unsettles me, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you think it says about a society that could be moved to open its purse by a costume faster than by an honest account of actual need. This is Soil of Crime, and if a story like this is worth telling honestly, subscribe so the next one finds you. Mary Carrol did not work alone. Her letters, the specific written appeals that carried her story into the grandest houses in London, were crafted by a man named Edward Johnson, who also went by the alias Watson, and whose actual skill lay not in Mary's costume but in his own pen. Johnson did not simply write a single generic sob story and mail identical copies out indiscriminately to whichever wealthy address happened to come to mind. He composed distinct letters, each one carefully tailored to its specific intended recipient, layering in exactly the kind of individualized detail that made a stranger's suffering feel, to the person actually reading it, like a private and particular appeal rather than a mass solicitation sent out blind. Among his named targets were the Bishop of London, the Marquis of Londonderry, and the Countess of Ripon, three of the most prominent, most frequently solicited figures in the entire country, each selected not at random, but precisely because their position all but guaranteed a household staffed well enough to receive and read a letter carefully rather than discard it unopened. Figures of that considerable rank were, by the very nature of their public standing, expected to be seen giving generously and often, their charitable reputations forming a genuine, actively maintained component of the social authority and respect they held, which made them simultaneously the most difficult targets to approach directly, and once a letter actually reached them personally, among the most reliably generous once persuaded. Johnson's choice of recipients reflected a shrewd understanding of exactly that tension. Aim high enough that a single success could be worth more than a dozen smaller ones, and trust that a title carried with it an expectation of charity too strong for its holder to easily ignore. The letter that finally reached a servant on Sloane Square, and that would eventually be read aloud in open court as evidence against her, described Mary as a widow afflicted with rheumatism and, in the letter's own careful phrasing, divers other complaints, burdened with a large family, and recently made entirely destitute when her husband was killed by a gentleman's passing carriage. It closed with a signature from a Mr. Churton of Ebury Street, a name presented as an independent, respectable reference vouching for her character, and recommending that whoever read the letter extend her whatever help they reasonably could. The claim of a husband killed by a gentleman's carriage deserves its own moment of attention, because it was not a random detail. Traffic accidents involving fashionable carriages and working-class pedestrians were a genuine, recurring feature of London street life in this period, common enough that the claim required no elaborate explanation to sound plausible, and pointed enough to suggest, without directly accusing anyone specific, that the very class of person now being asked for charity bore some indirect responsibility for the widow's loss in the first place. It was, whether by calculation or instinct, an appeal built to make refusal feel not merely uncharitable, but faintly complicit. Consider the layered dishonesty built into that single closing signature. It was not enough in Johnson's design for Mary's own account of her suffering to stand on its own. The letter needed a second, seemingly independent voice, a named local gentleman willing to put his own reputation behind her story. Because a stranger's grief asks for charity, but a respected neighbor's endorsement asks for trust. And trust in a city this size traveled considerably further than sympathy alone ever could. I want you to picture the actual mechanics of what Johnson and Carrol were running here, because it deserves to be understood as a genuine operation rather than a single opportunistic lie. One partner supplied the visual performance, the widow's dress, the drawn face, the practiced voice. The other supplied the written architecture, individualized letters, invented witnesses, carefully targeted recipients, chosen for their wealth and their reputation for generosity. Between the two of them, they had built something considerably closer to a small, working business than a single desperate improvisation, a genuine division of labor with each partner contributing the specific skill the other lacked, and it very likely fed them for longer and more reliably than honest casual labor ever could have offered a woman and a letter writer with no other trade to fall back on. Subscribe now so you do not miss how it finally came apart. This is Soil of Crime. It came apart, in the end, not through any grand detective work, but through the same everyday commercial suspicion that has undone a great many long-running schemes throughout this record. Mary Carrol attempted to present one of Johnson's letters at a chemist's shop, seeking money directly rather than simply delivering a written appeal for the household to consider at leisure, and it was there, face to face with a shopkeeper's assistant, who had likely seen more than one practiced beggar's story before, that suspicion finally hardened into action. She was arrested attempting to beg money in person on the strength of a letter that had already, by that point, made its way into some of the wealthiest houses in London. The case came before Mr. Burrell at Queen's Square Police Court in early December 1839, where the full letter was read into the record, its claims of rheumatism, of a dead husband, of a large and desperate family, laid bare in open court, as the fiction Johnson had constructed it to be. London in 1839 already possessed institutional machinery specifically built to catch exactly this kind of fraud. The Society for the Suppression of Mendicity, formed as far back as 1818, had spent 2 decades developing methods for distinguishing genuine destitution from practiced performance, most notably by offering suspected beggars investigation tickets rather than direct cash, a system designed to send a claim through verification before any money actually changed hands. A member of the public approached by a beggar could hand over one of the Society's own printed tickets instead of coin, directing the recipient to the Society's office, where a caseworker would investigate the claim. Visit the address given, confirm or deny the story, and only then release whatever assistance the case actually warranted. It was, in its own way, an early attempt at exactly the kind of verification system Mary Carrol's costume was specifically designed to bypass, substituting institutional investigation for the instant, unverifiable sympathy a widow's dress could produce on a doorstep in under a minute. Mendicity officers, men like William Horsford, whose name survives in the records of the era, worked London's streets specifically watching for beggars who moved between multiple addresses and multiple stories in a single day, exactly the pattern Mary Carrol's own operation depended on. These officers came to know the working circuits of professional begging the way a modern detective might come to know a particular criminal's habits. tracking familiar faces from one prosperous square to the next, comparing notes on which costumes and which stories tended to travel together. Mary Carrol's arrest, when it finally came, was less a matter of luck than of exactly this kind of accumulated, patient, institutional attention finally catching up with a scheme that had, by December of 1839, already been running long enough to attract notice. Queen's Square Police Court itself, where Mary Carrol's case was heard, was one of a network of magistrates' courts established across London earlier in the century specifically to handle exactly this volume of minor criminal business, cases too small and too numerous for the higher courts to process individually, but serious enough to require some formal record and some formal punishment. A single sitting before a magistrate like Mr. Burrell might move through dozens of cases in a morning, drunkenness, petty theft, vagrancy, and fraud alike. Each defendant granted only as much of the court's attention as their case genuinely required before the docket moved on to the next name. The broader legal framework surrounding her arrest had been tightening for over a decade by the time she was finally caught. The Vagrancy Act of 1824 had already made begging itself a criminal offence, treating anyone without what the law called a visible means of maintaining themselves as liable to arrest regardless of the specific method they used to ask for help. Combined with the deliberately harsh, deterrent logic of the 1834 Poor Law, the legal environment Mary Carrol operated inside treated poverty itself with almost as much suspicion as fraud, a climate that made her particular gamble, trading a criminal risk for the chance of real money from genuinely wealthy targets, considerably more understandable as a calculated choice than as simple moral failure. There is a version of this story that reduces Mary Carrol to nothing more than a clever cheat exploiting decent people's sympathy, and this record has no interest in leaving it there uncomplicated. A woman working London's streets in 1839, however dishonestly, was still operating inside a system that had just spent 5 years redesigning itself specifically to make legitimate poverty as unbearable as possible, on the theory that suffering itself was the best deterrent against dependency. Genuine widows with genuine large families, and no husband's income to fall back on faced exactly the same closed doors the workhouse system was designed to present, and a great many of them, unlike Mary Carrol, had no letter-writing partner and no working costume clever enough to turn that closed door into an open one, even briefly. Whatever judgment this case deserves for the specific cruelty of impersonating a grieving widow, it belongs alongside an honest reckoning with exactly how narrow the legitimate options actually were for a woman in Mary Carrol's position who had no trade, no protector, and no institution willing to help her without first stripping her of whatever dignity she had left. If that complicates how simply you want to judge her, subscribe and tell me in the comments whether you think the law of 1839 left her any genuinely honest path at all. This is Soil of Crime. Mary Carrol was sentenced to 3 months' hard labour. Edward Johnson, the letter's actual author, was tried alongside her as a co-defendant, the man whose pen had done at least as much work as her costume in extracting sympathy and money from 3 of the most prominent names in England. Johnson's own history before this case, like Mary's, survives only in fragments. That he wrote under at least one alias, Watson, suggests a man already practiced in maintaining more than one identity before this particular partnership ever began. Someone for whom Edward Johnson may itself have been only one name among several. He answered to depending on the situation and the audience. Beyond the court record of that sentence, the surviving documentation of Mary Carrol's own life is remarkably thin. No birth record has been definitively matched to her. No account of what became of her after her release, whether she returned to the same trade or found some other way to survive, has come down to us with any confidence. She exists in the historical record available to this account, almost entirely as a defendant, a costume, and a letter read aloud in a police court on a December morning nearly 2 centuries ago. That thinness is itself worth naming honestly, because it says something true about whose lives Victorian record-keeping considered worth preserving in detail. A duke's fraudulent claim to another duke's fortune generated a decade of newspaper coverage, court transcripts, and surviving pamphlets. A working-class woman's 3-month sentence for impersonating a widow generated a single paragraph in a magistrate's docket, briefly newsworthy and then forgotten. Mary Carrol was real, was prosecuted, was sentenced, and then simply disappears from the record the moment the state finished punishing her. Pattern this series has traced again and again among the poorer women who appear in it. Compare her 3 months of hard labor against the far gentler treatment this series has already documented for women operating at the other end of Victorian society's social ladder. A respectable married medium caught in the act of fraud might face nothing harsher than a damaged reputation and a change of city. A woman with the right connections, the right manner of speech, and the right neighborhood address could sustain a fraud for years before facing any criminal consequence at all. Mary Carrol, with no such protection and no such address, was caught, sentenced, and forgotten within a single winter, the full weight of the law landing considerably harder and considerably faster on the woman who had the least to fall back on once it did. London's aristocratic households, meanwhile, adapted their own defences against exactly this kind of appeal over the following decades, developing increasingly formalised systems of household staff specifically tasked with screening correspondence, forwarding genuine charitable requests to established almoners, and dismissing the rest before they ever reached the family directly. The very success of schemes like Mary Carrol's and Edward Johnson's helped drive that institutional hardening, each successful letter making the next household a little warier, a little more likely to interpose a servant, a secretary, or a formal charity between the family and any stranger's written appeal. The phenomenon she was part of, however, did not disappear nearly so quickly. 11 years later, in May of 1850, Charles Dickens, already one of the most famous writers in England, published an essay in his own magazine, Household Words, titled The Begging Letter Writer, cataloguing the many fraudulent appeals he had personally received across his career and arguing, with real bitterness, that letters like the ones Mary Carrol and Edward Johnson once wrote did lasting damage to genuine charity itself, making generous people warier, slower, and more suspicious of every appeal that followed, honest or not. Dickens argued that the writers of such letters deserved harsher punishment than many of the men Britain was then transporting to its penal colonies, a level of personal fury that suggests exactly how persistent and how widely resented this particular fraud had remained across more than a decade of London life. His own fame, following the runaway success of the Pickwick Papers in the late 1830s, had made him a specific, recurring target for exactly this kind of appeal, and by 1850 he had accumulated enough personal experience of fabricated widows, invented illnesses, and borrowed misfortune to write about the pattern with the weary specificity of a man who had been fooled, or nearly fooled, more than once. What he was describing, more than a decade after Mary Carrol's own conviction, was not a single case but an entire established trade, one with its own recognizable conventions, its own recurring costumes and phrases, sturdy enough to survive individual prosecutions like hers without the underlying practice ever actually disappearing. I want to leave you with the question this particular case has never let this record answer comfortably. Mary Carrol's fraud worked because Victorian London had built an entire social language around mourning, around widowhood, around the specific visual signals of a woman deserving of unquestioned sympathy, and she simply learned to speak that language fluently enough to be believed by people considerably more powerful than herself. Whether you think that makes her more clever than most of the swindlers examined in this record or simply more desperate is a question this account genuinely cannot settle for you. Tell me what you think in the comments, and subscribe if you want more forgotten cases held to that same honest scrutiny. That is the case of Mary Carrol, the widow who was never a widow at all. This is Soil of Crime. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. And tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. Every comment keeps these forgotten stories alive, and we read everyone. I will see you in the next case. Queen's Square Police Court no longer stands in the form Mary Carrol would have known it. Absorbed long ago into the ordinary redevelopment of central London, and no marker anywhere records the address on Sloane Square, where a servant once carried her letter inside for a household to read. The Society for the Suppression of Mendicity's own careful ticket system, and the Vagrancy Act it worked alongside, eventually gave way to more organized, charitable structures across the following century. But the underlying trade Mary Carrol and Edward Johnson practiced, a costume, a letter, a story pitched precisely to the sympathies of a stranger, never entirely vanished. It simply changed its paper and its postage, waiting, the way it always has, for whichever era's version of a widow's weeds proves hardest to turn away from the door. Mary Carrol's own name appears nowhere else in the surviving record of 19th century London beyond that single December docket, 3 months of hard labour, and a letter still legible enough, nearly 200 years later, for a researcher to read her fabricated grief back into the light. Whether she returned afterward to the same trade, found some other way to survive a city that offered women in her position vanishingly few honest alternatives, or simply disappeared into the same anonymous poverty that had made her scheme necessary in the first place, is a question this record cannot answer, because no one in 1839 thought her story worth following past the moment her sentence was handed down. That silence is, in its own way, exactly the ending her case deserves preserved honestly. A woman who spent one winter borrowing London's sympathy for the dead, remembered afterward only as long as it took the state to decide she had been punished enough.